Hello everybody, it's Michael Hollands once again for Sound of the Movies. Today I have the pleasure to be joined by the legendary actor Brian Cox. On this episode, we will talk about his career, his new autobiography called Putting the Rabbit in the Hat, and of course, Succession. It is my pleasure to welcome Brian Cox.
Hello.
Hello, Brian. How are you doing?
I'm okay. I'm in my house in the country, and it's all. We haven't been here for a while, so nothing's working.
Great.
But at least I can talk.
Great. And thank you very much for taking the time out of your schedule to talk to me today. I really appreciate that. It's an honor and a pleasure. And Brian, at first, I would like to talk about your beginnings. As I understand, and I also read your book, of course, your father passed away when you were very young. If I recall correctly, you were 8 years old when your dad passed away. Was this a time you fell in love with movies?
I think I fell in love with movies a little earlier than that. I mean, I used to go to the movies really from a very early age, from about the age of 5. I started going to the movies, and I started going on my own when I was about 6. So I'd already been going to the movies. I'd already been certainly I've had 3 years experience. So I fell in love with the movies. But of course, when you have such tragedy around you with first of all, my father passed, and then subsequently my mother's breakdowns that she had. And she had to have electric shock treatment, which was pretty horrible. So in a way, I became far too self-reliant, far too young. Within that self-reliance, of course, the movies was my comforter. In fact, I remember I'm a great television watcher, and I remember the day of my father's funeral, I didn't go to the funeral, but instead there was this new thing. Television was pretty new then. So, and a cousin of mine, Rose Cox, she was my cousin. She, much older than me, I mean, a lot older than me, because I was very young. I mean, my father was the youngest of 13, and his oldest sister was 25 when he was born, So there was so my cousins were all quite old people. I didn't have any cousins of my own age. But what happened was they put me in front of the television set as the funeral was happening, so I sat in front of television. And of course, I've always found television a great comforter as a result. And I think it goes back to that experience, that I had. And so naturally, television, film, but it was always the movies. I mean, it was the movies for me right from the word go. And also the whole business about being an actor came even earlier than that, when I was, when my dad first put me on we used to have a coal bunker in the access of the window recess of our flat. And my dad, from New Year's time, he would put me on that was my first stage. So the performing thing went very much hand in hand. And then I think there was natural kind of sucker from when my pa died and my ma was really, she was away for quite a little bit of my childhood. So I think the cinema was a great comfort to me.
And thank you very much for elaborating on that, Brian. And I think it must have been very hard to grow up under those circumstances and to become an actor and to really harness your craft and your strength. And you've become one of the world's finest actors. I really mean that from the bottom of my heart. You are one of the most versatile and best actors around. I would like to talk about your book, which is now available everywhere. And I just finished it a couple of days ago, and it's a tremendous read. I really loved it. I would like to talk about the process of writing a book in the first place. I mean, you had to select so many stories and also recount so many stories and also events which took place in your life, the work relationship with your peers and theater, film, television. And Brian, if I may ask, what experience and or collaboration with your peers holds a special place in your heart?
I've been very lucky with the people I've worked with, and the people who sort of mentored me when I was at the start of my career. I was very fortunate. And I also came at a time of the wave of the free cinema of the early 60s in the UK. With, as I say in the book, I always wanted to be an actor, and I didn't think it was possible because, and of course, I always, even as a child, when I used to play, I always played American. It was like cowboys and Indians, so that was the thing. I was American, and the movies were all American. I never really had much connection with this sort of English films because they were alien to me. I'm a Scot, so I just felt a lot of those films. But I had much more in common with watching James Cagney and Humphrey Bogart and Marlon Brando and James Dean. I mean, I had a much more connection with that, and that was really for me the sort of influence that I wanted. And then when I saw Albert Finney in Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, which of course was an English film, but it was a working class film. I come from a very feudal culture, everybody in their place, to its detriment. It still exists. They say it doesn't, but it does. What was for me, what Albert did and what that whole movement did, led by Lindsay Anderson, Carl Rice, Tony Richardson, and also John Schlesinger as well, it kind of liberated me to say, oh, I see what's possible. And seeing Albert, I thought, because Albert and I, was often, people thought when I was younger, I looked like Albert. In fact, there was an incident when Albert and I were appearing in a play together, and the guy was talking. The guy was saying, "You're Albert." Who sent me? You're Albert Finney, and there was two photographs, long photo. It was outside the Royal Court. There's one of Albert, and there's one of me. And he said, "You're Albert Finney," and I said, "No." He said, "No, you're Albert Finney." I said, "No, I'm not Albert Finney." And then I took him to the photograph and said, "That's me." That was Albert, and I said, "And that's Albert Finney." So he said, "Oh, sorry." But no, I mean, that was the thing, and also I never thought about the theatre. I always thought about movies. So coming into the theatre was such an extraordinary experience. I started when I was 15. I got a job by extraordinary circumstance. That was one of the great things, was going into the theatre and then discovering that whole other strain of the classics of the classical stage, Shakespeare, Chekhov. And then that became a sort of motivating force for me, that I wanted to embrace that. And then when I went to drama school, of course, I did so. And that was, for me, drama school was like a university. I used it. I learned so much at drama school. I learned about myself. I learned about my own shortcomings, because drama school can be tough because you have to deal with yourself. You're questioning and organizing and learning. You're in the process of learning. That was what was so lucky. And then my first job after leaving drama school, I went to work with a wonderful man called Tom Fleming, who was doing romance stuff in Scotland, in Edinburgh. Not ready for the Edinburgh, unfortunately, the Edinburgh elite. We were doing Mrożek plays. We were doing all kinds of things which were unheard of in those days. And but Tom was a visionary, and unfortunately, it only lasted a year. And then I moved on to Birmingham Rep, where I worked with another mentor, which was a man called Peter Dews, who taught me about Shakespeare. I've always been in the mode of, I don't think you ever stop learning as an actor. I think that's the key to what we do, is it's constantly being open to ideas and constantly being embracing of new thoughts, and I think that goes back to my childhood. I had no alternative because I was so much on my own as a kid. I had only had my own imagination at my disposal,
Yes.
and how I dealt with the situation I was in with a mother who was not at all well, a father who's gone, who's passed, tragically gone, and I missed him terribly. And so I had to really take care of myself, and I became very independent, probably too independent actually, in a young age. And it's always been I'm very much happy in my own company, which is a good thing. But at the same time, I'm also in groups. When I'm in big companies, I do this thing of talking. I talk about it in the book. I go absent. I go off somewhere. We used to have these parties, and I would disappear at the last minute because I didn't want to see the start of the party. It was a sort of thing with me, that I did. So that was the thing that was mostly, meeting people like Lindsay Anderson and then a wonderful stage director called Michael Elliott. So I always kind of frog leaped with these extraordinary people who I learned so much from as a young actor. And I was very young,
Yes.
I was a professional actor from the age of 19,
Yes.
and I had been in the theater since I was 15. So actually, I've just celebrated, in September, I celebrated my 60th year in the theater, which is pretty incredible, really.
That's a great accomplishment, and thank you very much for elaborating on that, Brian. And you basically always performed for an audience. When you are on stage, the audience is right there with you, and when you are working for a television production or a film, you eventually also perform for the audience. Do you see a difference acting wise, whether it's on stage versus screen and television?
Not really. The only difference is one of scale. I mean, the truth is the truth in any language. I mean, I learned that when I went to work in Russia in the 1980s. I could tell, some wonderful, incredible actors in Russia. And you could always tell, even though I didn't get the language, even though I didn't have any Russian, but I could tell when someone was on and when someone was equally off,
Yes.
because there is something about the truth is the truth in any language. I don't know what it is. It's an extraordinary thing, really. But I mean, I just through my training, I could say, he's not quite hitting it. Oh, she's amazing. Oh, and this was in Russia. And basically, I mean, I'd have to say, and always in Russia, it was always the best. I witnessed the best actors, the best, and of course they have such a dedicated theatre culture. Right from Stanislavski onwards.
Yes.
The Moscow Arts, and it's very heady and it's very, you go wow, because they took it very seriously, unlike what. Where we tend to see the theatre, even nowadays in the UK, they still see it as a kind of amateur pursuit. Whereas in Russia and culture, and I think Germany is also similar, because Germany has a very strong tradition. And it's basically because it's a kind of Republican, I mean, with a small p, small r, Republican tradition, in the sense of a republic, which creates. It's very interesting to me that I see that cinema is very much the product of egalitarian cultures like France and America. They're already, they're cultures which are socially based, so they created great cinema. And the theatre ostensibly is part of the feudal system. It if you look at Shakespeare, but then when you examine Shakespeare very closely, he's deeply allegorical, so that he's telling tales out of school about his country and his society, because it all relates back to where he is. But it's a critical thing. You have to look beyond him sometimes to really get who he is. And that's very exciting. I mean, that's great when you work on Shakespeare, because it's like you're on an incredible voyage of discovery, because you're always finding the hidden aspect of Shakespeare, the Shakespeare that's going beyond his patronage, because he had this, he was patronized by various kind of royals of one description and another. And the theatre kind of moved in a way away from that. And that's why the theatre of the 50s and 60s, and why the 60s was an extraordinary time for me, because a working class boy from my part of the world was welcomed. It isn't the same anymore. We've gone back because we've not taken it seriously enough, and a lot of, somebody like me nowadays, their access to the theatre is very difficult. They don't have the same access that I had. And that period, I've just written about it recently, that period of social mobility in the UK was phenomenal. And I happen to be a product of that. And my actors of my generation are so lucky. And we look at actors of today and we see that there isn't the same kind of influence from the working classes as there used to be. It's still there, but it hasn't got the same profile that it had in the past, and it makes me very sad.
Yes.
That's happened.
I figure the theater experience must have been really fulfilling. I mean, you've played so many great parts. I mean, King Lear, Titus. Titus is a very demanding role, and I think I recall even Anthony Hopkins also played Titus, also directed by Julie Taymor, and he also, if I recall correctly, said it was really exhausting.
It is exhausting, but it's also, again, I think that Titus it's a young writer. It's Shakespeare at his height, because actually, ironically, Richard III and Titus is written exactly at the same time. I think it's 1595 or thereabouts. And the thing about Titus is that there's this young writer getting his rocks off about the older generation. And it's interesting, the difference between Titus and Lear. Lear is a much more weary play because it's a much more exhausting play. And it's also written by an older writer. And he's got his own family problems, which he encountered as he went back to live in Stratford. So and the whole nature of rejection, which is in there. Whereas Titus kind of deals with what I think is the sort of ludicrousness of life, of the dedication to an authority which doesn't serve you and finally lets you down. And you've dealt all your life with that authority, and said, Titus's first speech is about Rome, when he comes back and he says, Rome, here I am. This is where it's all happening. But of course, the Rome that he believed in no longer exists. It's highly corrupt, and they've just got rid of one emperor. They've got a completely Saturninus who's useless. And then Saturninus decides to get involved with these Titus's prisoners. So the whole thing has a ludicrousness about it. And that's what I loved about Shakespeare, because it's very funny. It's a very funny play. It's black and funny at the same time. And it deals in a way that I think is groundbreaking as a play. And it was never understood in the canon. People always, they used to, the idea was if you were asked to play Titus, it was because it was a desperation that we've got to do this play sometime. And nobody likes this play. Well, I think I was lucky enough to work with Deborah Warner, and we changed the whole idea of what Titus was. We said, you've all thought it's like this, but actually, it's actually about this. And that's a major achievement when one looks back and says, one rewrote the book on how Titus was interpreted. And then Julie Taymor did a similar thing as well. I have a story about that, but I won't go into it.
Okay. Now I'd like to talk a bit about your experience working with several directors. I mean, you've worked with major ones. Michael Mann, Manhunter. There was Wolfgang Petersen, Troy. You've worked with Woody Allen on Match Point, Wes Craven, Red Eye, David Fincher, Zodiac, Doug Liman, Bourne Identity. The list goes on and on. Which director do you think is the best one, or one of the best you ever worked with? Someone who elevates your game as an actor?
Spike Lee. Okay. Spike Lee is, and again, he's not given his full value, Spike Lee. He is a tremendous director. A really, really extraordinarily good director. Free, very open, but also very, very creative. And has, he has, in a quiet way, sometimes not so quiet, but he has a mission as a creator and as an African-American creator. And I was very lucky to get advantage of that. And I think I just thought Spike was amazing. And I really do think he was amazing. Of the film directors I've worked with, certainly. The theater directors I work with who are extraordinary. I've been very lucky in that way. Yes. There is always this problem in film, and it's a big problem, I think, and it's not a problem that's always recognized, which is between the literary aspect and the visual aspect of film.
Yes.
The great script, the words themselves, and then the visual stuff. I mean, it's interesting when somebody like David Fincher, for example, who's an extraordinarily talented man, but for instance, he would never notice the acting. So I remember when I did Zodiac, Mark Ruffalo and Anthony Edwards, who were playing the detectives, they had a hell of a time on that because he would do endless takes. He would do something like 38 takes. And, and the guys would go nuts. Now, I never had 38 takes. I was lucky. But what I realized was happening to him is that because he's so visually, his thing is about vision, physical, that's what he looks at. So he's looking at a scene, and he's only seeing the visual aspect of it. So the actors, by the 10th take, the actors are going, we're not getting any comeback on this. We're doing it again, but there's no reason why we're doing it again. Nobody says we can improve it by doing this or what have you. And then you realize that, in fact, it's an interesting thing, but it's a kind of, well, let me describe it properly. He's so concerned with the visual that he forgets that the acting is so organic that after a while you need to be able to know why you're doing it and what you're doing it for, and what it is that's missing if it's not working.
Yes.
And it's never that it's not working. It's just, the acting's fine. I'm really concerned about that. But what directors don't understand is the acting has to be taken care of, and it has to be a blend of the two. It's a balance of the visual and what I call the literate.
Yes.
Which is in the playing of the script. So a lot of directors are not that way inclined. Directors who are writers tend to be much more inclined that way, because they understand the writing process. They understand the totality of what they do. But some directors who are extremely successful and extremely good, no question about it. David Fincher is a remarkable director.
Yes.
But that element is an element which I just wish that he would be a bit more cognizant of, I'm only giving David as an example, but there are other directors the same,
I get your point, and it's a valid point, and I can totally understand your feelings. And to me, it's always a bit disappointing to hear stories of this kind, because you should not neglect certain aspects of the filmmaking process, because it needs to be well balanced. Of course, first of all, there's a script. If there is no script, there is no movie. Simple as that.
Exactly. You're absolutely right, Michael. That's the key thing. It has to be about the script. And the script, of course, the script allows you to do all kinds of things, but you mustn't forget the basic principles of the script,
yes,
which is the language and the argument and the debate that's in the film. That's why so many of the old films are so much better because of that. I mean, if you watch Capra, for example, Frank Capra, mm-hmm. Capra is very interested in the story and the point of the story. So all the actors are working towards a point. And you meet something like Meet John Doe or Mr. Deeds, or Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. I mean, it's a very good example because it's a highly political story.
Yes.
But if you don't acknowledge the force of the script, you're nowhere. And of course, Capra does that brilliantly, absolutely brilliantly.
Absolutely. And I would like to refer to the script as the foundation, because it's like building a house.
And there is problems in writings, like there are writers who fall in love with their writing, and sometimes a little is much better than a lot, and sometimes it's over verbose. They write it out too much. They don't leave enough. And that's the other thing that it's important. It's important to understand, and I think even actors don't understand this sometimes. It's important to understand what the audience brings to it, what the audience does. That factor that we don't take into account sometimes nearly enough is, where is it for the audience? How is the audience getting it? And how are we serving the audience in the right way? And I think that's vitally important.
Yes.
And I think sometimes actors, and this is one of the problems I have with a lot of to do with the method acting, which is all to do with the character and not to do with the story and the mise en scène. It's just, oh, my character. And you go, no, your character fits into a fabric, a framework of so many other things. So in a way, you've got to acknowledge that and understand your position within that. Now, one of the problems for me, for method acting, is it obfuscates so much of the time. It doesn't deal with the actor's responsibility in terms of the ensemble, in terms of the community that you create, and not in terms of the intention of the writers in the balance of each character.
Yes, yes.
So it's a tricky thing.
Yes, and I'm glad you brought up method acting because it's also in your book, and you've also described the circumstances behind The Boxer, which I also rewatched a couple of weeks ago, and it's a very good movie. Method acting is a double-edged sword. I think many actors are prone to method acting because they think they have a way to shape the character in a more appropriate fashion, or they can get inside the character. But ultimately, I think it wears you out and down because
it does. And the thing about the actor is there's got to be that part of the actor that is able to observe as well of what you're doing. That you're not just about doing it, you're also observing it in a very subtle and a very deep way, that it's not that you kind of give it its value by saying, my position is this, and I have to inhabit that position, but I can't go there because if I go there, I'm throwing the balance off. And this is something that actors don't understand. And especially when dealing with other actors, because other actors have to find where their place is. And that's why the community element is so important. I come from a background where the ensemble, especially if you worked in the classical theater, is vital. It is vital because, you've got a lot of actors who are, especially in big productions, who are playing little roles, and it's vital that their inclusion and their sense of responsibility is present,
That's another valid point. Thank you. I think you also need to, let's say, make sure that everything is authentic, and you need to make sure that it doesn't hurt your performance or your own personal well-being.
Well, exactly. I mean, the thing about it is that you hear stories of Nicolas Cage having teeth removed to do a job, and you go, it's so unnecessary. It is just unnecessary because to me the best actors are children. Children are the best actors. I do a video. There's a video I do, which is where I teach this little boy to be and not to be. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's well worth looking at. It's called Brian Cox's Masterclass with Theo. And I teach this little boy, and it happened one Christmas. He was 2.5. And we sat at this friend of mine's house in Scotland. And it was it was a breakfast. It was just before Christmas. And this kid, he was called Theo, his language skills were, for someone of 2.5, were quite extraordinary. So I tried an experiment. I taught him to be or not to be. And it was interesting, that his attention would go off and then it would come back. And one went with that flow of a child dealing with this material in the way that they dealt with it. But it was amazing. There was no research. There was no ground. He just did it. And he did it in a way that was, in fact, there's a gesture that he does in the video, which was totally his own. And you go, where did that come from? What was that about? And the other thing about acting, too, is that you've got to be able to turn on a dime. You've got to be able to back off at a moment's notice and then back on again. So you have to be so quick in your wit, and your wit is equally important as your emotional basis. Is your intellect as much important as your emotional content. You can't over worry it. You have to deal with the problem, build the wall, and realize, oh, I have to put a door in that wall as well now.
Yes.
Okay. Now I'll adjust to that.
Great, and thank you. Brian, before we talk about Succession, I would like to ask you, which part are you most proud of, or which part do you think was the most demanding or rewarding one film wise?
Well, it's a very interesting. I've been asked this quite a few times, and I mean, there's so many parts, like Hannibal Lecter, was a really interesting role to play, and I had a great relationship and I was mainly interested in the psychology of the man, and also that, and this funny, this came full circle when I played Goering. When I played Goering in Nuremberg, and it like that because Goering is probably the villain. If you take Goebbels, Himmler, Goering, and Hitler, they're pretty vilified. I had to understand, with Hannibal Lecter, that I had an image because I knew about there was when I became obsessed with a man who was a serial killer when I was 11, and this guy was amazing. He was very bright. It was called Peter Manuel in Scotland, and he had such an incredible strong point of view that he even conducted his own defense. He was as guilty as hell, but he was so intelligent, as was somebody like Ted Bundy. The rationale seemed so persuasive. You went, oh yeah, well and I certainly felt that with Hannibal, that he was much more. And this book about Nuremberg was that real evil is mundane. So when I came to play Goering, which is probably one of the most challenging roles, if not the most challenging role I played, I had to understand who the man was. And I had to understand how he came to be who he was. The first thing an actor mustn't do is ever judge their character. They have to decide who they are. No matter if they're a mass killer, if they're a serial killer, they have, and also you find that when you examine, there is a neglect somewhere. There's a line that gets broken that makes someone into something that they never intended to be, and yet they become.
Thank you very much for elaborating on that. Also, it was a great explanation, also in terms of your process and preparation. That brings me to Succession, because I think Succession is one of the finest shows on television today. It makes for great television. You've got great writing, great acting, beautiful music by Nicholas Britell. Jesse Armstrong created the show. You play media mogul Logan Roy. What do you think are Logan's best and worst characteristics as a human being and as a father and businessman?
Well, I think again, you see, it's very funny about Logan because I mean, I again, as I say, you don't judge the character. You don't judge. I mean, I think that Logan is essentially a very lonely person. He is by definition of his own state. I mean, he's responsible for his own loneliness, but because of circumstances which we haven't investigated totally, and we've hinted at throughout the show, the scratches on his back, the childhood that he had, the abuse, the tragedy of his sister and his mother, his background, and of course that has kind of developed in him a form of misanthropy. He's a misanthrope. He doesn't really like anybody, he doesn't, and he equally doesn't trust anybody. And of course, where he and I have in common is that we've had to be autodidacts. We've had to take care of ourselves on so many levels because of where we haven't been in the situation where we can blossom. Particularly, I mean, that's different from me because it all changed for me when I went into the theater, a whole different. But for the first 15 years of my life, it was not easy, but I didn't see it. I just got on with it. So I think Logan and I have that much in common. We certainly have a sort of background in common, though he's probably a little bit more. He's better off than I am. He's a bit more. I think he started off quite well off to start with. He had an inheritance. But what's interesting about him is that it's his misanthropy, but his lack of trust. The first question I asked Jesse Armstrong, because of the way he was to his children, I said, does he love his children? And Jesse said, oh yes, he loves his children very much. We didn't go any further than that, but then I realized that the problem is that he doesn't know how to express his love. It's hard love. He doesn't know how to express it at all. He's incapable of saying "I love you" to his kids. He doesn't know. That's not in his vocabulary. It's not in his lexicon at all as a human being, and therefore there is a default with him, a big default in that expression, and he's never found that. And the only thing that sustained him is wealth, is the accumulation of stuff. Unnecessarily is a judgment, but that's who he is. He has become one of the wealthiest men in the world, and for those reasons. And it's worked. It's worked because it's relentless. It's ruthless. He is ruthless.
Yes.
But that's how he operates. That's how he has succeeded, is his ruthlessness. But at the same time, he's trying to, in this whole succession thing, he is trying to find a successor. Now he's not exactly going about it the right way, but at the same time, he has these horrible children, and they are truly vile. They are, and they are deprived, and of course there's all kinds of debates that get thrown up by the show. Is the deprivation. If you deprive kids of love, they behave in a certain kind of way. That's true to a certain extent.
Yes.
But there's also individual responsibility. There's also the responsibility of, that we kind of, we tend to blame our conditions sometimes too much and say, it's these conditions that have made me the way I am. And you go, no, actually, there's an element of choice about choosing certain things. And that's, as the actor, you kind of go, well, I can choose that or I can choose that. And Logan has chosen to kind of live in a kind of state of isolation, and therefore he's misunderstood because of that. Everybody thinks, oh, he's horrible, he's so evil. There's a wonderful dinner scene that I have with Kendall. When we go to the wedding, in Italy, and I don't attend the wedding for reasons which I won't go on about because I don't want to give anything away. But there's a very, very vital scene where he clearly wants his son to come back into the fold, and the son is going through the long night of the soul, dark night of the soul. He's not capable. He can't do it. So there's a point in the evening where and because they play these endless games, because they've all played games together, they play these awful games. There's a point in the evening when the dinner arrives and there's a plate that's being set down for Kendall, and he said, no, that's for him. So the plate is handed over to Logan. So the plate is there. Jeremy's there. He's got his plate, and it's the same food. And Logan is thinking, what's going on? Oh, I see. So what the audience think is, and what seems ostensible, is, oh, Logan thinks he's trying to poison him. Of course he's not trying to poison him. He's just made a mistake. And he does it. And Logan thinks, oh, I'm going to teach him a lesson. So what he does is he calls his grandson. He says, where are the kids? And he calls the grandson in. And he says, do you like pasta? And the grandson says, well, not much. He said, try this. And so he gets the grandson to test the pasta. Of course, Kendall is horrified because he thinks, oh, my father thinks I'm trying to poison him. And he's tested it on my son. No, he's no intention of poisoning his grandson. But he's every intention of saying, listen, you fucker, don't play these games with me because I can play them better than you can. And you'll see that ostensibly it seems like, oh, this is cruel, he's being cruel. But no, of course he's not going to poison his grandson. He's tough and vicious and all that hard, but he's not going to do that. But what he's saying is, oh, you've done this thing with that's for him. And you want to put a question in my mind. all right, you've put the question in my mind, and now I'm going to show you what the result of that question will be.
Yes.
And that's where Logan, to me, is incredibly smart.
There are so many great scenes in this show. I mean, one of my favorite episodes, I think it was episode number 3 of season 2, when some of the kids are contacted by this biographer, and Logan is trying to set up a deal, and then this meeting happens, and he conducts this game. I think it was called Boar on the Floor. That was brilliant acting, and one of the standout episodes of Succession for me personally. The characters are so interesting. Tom is one of my favorites. I think he is so desperate when it comes to approval. He is seeking for approval, and he also tries, I think, to hide his insecurities. This is also a reason why he, let's say, treats other people the way he treats them. I think at his core, he is a good person, but he is thrown into this shark tank, which is very disheartening to him, perhaps also, and he doesn't know where he's at with Siobhan.
Yeah, exactly. You're absolutely right. I mean, you've hit it. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and Matthew plays it. He plays it to perfection, and he's an example. You see, this is why what I love about my fellow countrymen, my fellow Brits, is they have the discipline, and yet they don't have any less commitment. But they have the discipline, and they have the intellectual understanding of where the whole movement of the thing should go, And Matthew is exemplary. Great cast. I mean,
Yeah.
Kieran
Yeah.
and Jeremy. I mean, Jeremy does put himself through it, but by God, he always comes up with the stuff at the end of the day. He certainly does, except I just worry about his health.
Okay.
But mind you, that character is like that. That's why you've got to be careful with Kendall, because it's... he's a very fragile individual,
Okay. So you think Jeremy kind of takes it too seriously at times? His role, his performance?
Well, I think it's his conditioning. I think it's the way he believes that, he's a person of his culture. And he believes, it's very much I mean, he wouldn't say it's Strasbourg at all, but it's very much influenced by that kind of, getting into the role. And also he did work as Dan Day-Lewis's assistant for several years, so that sort of rubbed off on him, But it's interesting because what I see is that after a while, it's very funny. I just heard a story about Robert De Niro. Now, Robert De Niro is probably one of the most method-like actors ever of all days. And I've got a friend of him who's working with him now, who's just worked with him. And he says he is just a sweetheart. He said he'll do anything. He said, oh, yeah, do you want me to do that? Oh, yeah, I'll do that. There's none of that stuff anymore. Because at the age of 78, it's just a bit embarrassing. I mean, Daniel Day-Lewis retired at 55 because he knows he couldn't go on at that level. Yes. I mean, I'm hoping that, because Dan's a wonderful actor, I'm hoping that he hasn't retired. He comes back and he spends his twilight years having a jolly good time enjoying what he does.
Yes. Yeah. Daniel Day-Lewis is a fantastic actor, and as is Robert.
Oh, he's incredible.
As is Robert De Niro.
They've had that dedication. And I'm not, and that is not to say anything about other dedication, the other disciplines that actors have given, who don't go down that particular road,
Yes.
I mean, Tony Hopkins is a genius actor, but he hasn't gone down that road at all. But then again, that's to do with the difference between the European culture and the American culture.
What I was going to say also about Logan, his methods are questionable sometimes, and he's also an opportunist. I think it's at the end of season 1 when the waiter who attends the wedding is killed and Kendall leaves the scene, goes back to his hotel room. Somebody spots him, and then the next day you call him up and say, well, I think we can find a way out of this terrible scenario and situation. And that was also brilliant because Kendall also once again maneuvered himself into a very terrible situation. So he basically once again set up a roadblock for himself and screwed up his deal.
I mean, the tragedy is, I mean, I think that what the overall feeling of the show is that, you know, it really does attack unbridled wealth. An unbridled wealth puts people in a situation where, as my mother used to say in a very Scottish accent, it's no real. It's not real. And they live in a dual reality, and that's what they do. And of course, we've witnessed it so historically at the moment with the horrific Trump family. You know, we've seen this, you know, this level of entitlement. And where does it come from? What have they done? What have they created? What have they offered to the world? What have they done? They haven't done anything. You know, they believe that they should, you know, have carte blanche, and they don't believe that there's any discipline involved. There's any, you know, there's any giving. You know, it's all about taking. You know, it's not about giving. It's about taking. And I think even Logan doesn't believe it's all about taking. I think that Logan, his own way, has given, because he's created an empire. So there's a thing that he has given. There was a wonderful scene at the end of the final episode of the season, which sadly had to be cut, where one of the kids is told in no uncertain terms about by one of the. See, there's the other family also. There's the kids, but there's also the company family. There's Jerry, there's Carl, there's Frank.
Yes.
Frank, who he's fired and rehired for years, but they're still part of the family. They're as much part of the family as the kids are. And also he's loyal to them. I mean, he sacks them and he brings them back, but he does have a loyalty to those people, you know, because they've stayed the course, you know, and it's a tough, they realize it's a tough course, but they've stayed the course. And so there's a lot to be respected from, he has, I think, a lot of, doesn't make any fuss about it, but he does actually have, they're also part of that family. And you can't avoid it. It's in the writing, you know, it's not obvious in the writing, but it's there because they haven't gone, they haven't departed, they're still there, they're still functioning. She is made temporary CEO. In a way, he thinks he can, and he's rude about her and he's anything, but there's something about consistency.
That's also one of the brilliant aspects of the show, because it does have comedic aspects, so at times it's very funny, but it's also very realistic.
Very funny.
Realistic in terms of the portrayal of the corporate environment. There's a great deal of realism there also, you know, the cutthroat environment. You have to be a killer. Yeah. And when it comes to picking a successor for your character, there are likely candidates. Kendall, who I think has some business acumen, and he seems to be a very, very smart guy. Romulus, as you like to call him at times, he is also kind of a smart guy, but very childish, insecure.
Yeah. Well, that's the interesting thing about him.
Yeah.
He's actually done a lot of very good stuff. Mm-hmm. He solved the problem in the last episode when we had the Middle Eastern money, and he realized it was fake and they kidnapped him, and he saw through that, and that meant a lot to Logan, because he suddenly saw, oh, there is some kind of extraordinary potential in this boy.
Yes.
But of course he is driven by his potty mouth. I mean,
absolutely.
That's his problem.
Yes, and Connor is kind of the how to put this, the space cadet.
He's probably Asperger's, Connor. He's probably got a disability.
Well, Connor, I love the whole idea, him trying to run for presidency. it was amusing, and of course he is ambitious. And then a Roman comes up to him. Well, you're running for presidency, and you've done what's before? Nothing. You're going from Sip Nada to the highest office in the world. I like his character, but he's got a lot of issues, I must say.
I think Connor is the one that has clear mental issues.
Siobhan is kind of, a loudmouth. at times. She's very condescending at times.
And she's very manipulative too. You know, she's really very sort of. I mean, she's very much her father's daughter in one sense, just in terms of her kind of the way she manipulates situations.
Yes.
She's a little bit naked in her manipulation. Logan is a little bit more closet in his manipulations.
Yes.
She kind of comes up, and she does talk too much. She does talk too much. That's her biggest mistake. That's the great thing about Logan is very understated. That's why he's still, and that's what's important. He's still a mystery to a lot of the people. He's still a mystery, you know, and he will remain so. We're not going to kind of go, oh, Logan is really this. No, you'll never know where Logan really, you know, unless there's some kind of deathbed confession or something. But you'll never know. You'll never know.
Did you and the cast at first, when you started working together, try to socialize as much as you could to really...
Oh, we are very social. We're very social. We all of us get on very well. You know, we do. We all get on. We all really like one another. You know,
Right.
I mean, and Jeremy is a very sweet man. I mean, Jeremy is one of the nicest men. You know, you know, he really is and a great father. I've watched him with his kids, and he's exemplary. You know, and Kieran is a delight. I mean, he's just a delight, and he's a wonderful example because he was a child actor, so there's no agenda with Kieran. He doesn't have any. He can't be doing with all that kind of method stuff. He really is a sort of, and that's what child actors have. They have a real grasp of it because they do it. They just do it. They don't question it. They do it. Sarah is a remarkable actress. Remarkable. Really extraordinary actress, you know,
Yes.
and it shows. And Matthew as well. And Alan Ruck, you know, so all of them, you know, they are flawless actors. They really are. And Nicholas, of course, and Nicholas. And it's hard for him because his character being his character, and because he's so tall, you know, he gets a little confused. And I think he's found moments when it's been tough for him because you know, this is the other thing too, Michael, that's important to realize is that, you know, who knows? I don't think it's going to go on a long time. We'll certainly get one more series. We're certainly doing one more series. We might do a fifth, but I think that would be it. And so in a way, I have to, and I keep saying to people like Nicholas, just remember you're an actor, and you have to go on acting. You don't want to be stuck. You know, it's great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for everything on this show, and bless you all. And it's all wonderful, and it's given us all incredible opportunities, and you know, and well-being, you know, financially. But at the same time, you're an actor, and all you want to do is act. So you want to continue acting, even when this show is over. You want to be going on to pastures new, you know. And I think that's key. That's key. But they're all incredibly sensible in that way. I mean, that's what I love about the company.
Acting-wise, I was curious as to how you handle intense, stressful scenes and how that's actually the process behind it, because it can be taxing and exhausting. So do you like to just to take a break in between certain scenes and say, well, I need to recuperate and then we can have another go? Or are you in such a zone, so to speak, that you just keep going?
I keep going. I'm a war horse, you know. I mean, I just keep going. I mean, I'm absolutely. You're getting me in a. I'm in a pretty state of exhaustion at the moment. Because I've just done 3 films since I finished.
Oh God.
Succession. So I've been working pretty steadily, and I realized I'd push this last film I did was such a strain because I was really on the point of, and I have been exhausted. I mean, I was working in a state of exhaustion, but that's me. I'm last man standing, you know. it's not always a good thing to be, but that's who I am. I've lived my life like that, and I think it's because because I love the job and I adore the job, and the job has been my life, and I live that life. Sometimes I need to just say no. I mean, the COVID thing was very good for me because I was not working as much in the previous years, so that was actually great. And if you're in an enforced situation, you go, okay, you acknowledge it. There's no good fighting it, because certainly not with what we've been through. There's no point fighting it and going, oh no, this is not good. You just say, oh well, that's them. And I think I'm very blessed with that constitution, that I'm quite accepting of certain situations. If there are certain things which are mitigating that I don't do it, okay, that's fine. But then I will carry on regardless.
You've been working for so many years, for decades, and what a career you've had. And you won the Golden Globe for Succession. And I was just recently, of course, rewatching several of your movies, and I was watching Running with Scissors, which is a very, very interesting movie. It also does have comedic aspects, but it also deals with mental illness. Well, let's just say that the whole family is pretty much
screwed.
Screwed up a bit. That was also a stellar cast. I mean, Alec Baldwin was in there again. You had worked with him also on Nuremberg, but also Annette Bening was in there, and Evan Rachel Wood.
I had the most delightful time on that film, and I worked with Ryan Murphy, and Ryan was great. We had a great time. It was one of the first films that he had done, and I think it suffered a little bit because he wasn't quite allowed to edit it the way I think he should have edited it, the way he wanted to edit it. I think there was a lot more stuff, more interesting stuff that could have been used. About the guy I'm playing's condition, who ended up dressed up as Father Christmas in a hotel room, being beaten up by Gwyneth Paltrow, saying, come on, Dad, come back. And I thought there was some stuff that they cut out, which I just think needed more investigation. And it was an editorial where they just tried to round it off, which I think was a shame. But it was a very interesting kind of film to work on. It was a great fun. We had great fun on that film. I really enjoyed it, and they were all great. It was such a nice cast. Yeah. I hadn't worked with Gwyneth, and she was delightful, Gwyneth Paltrow, and Alec, of course, I knew, and that was good, and of course, lovely Joe Clayborough.
Yeah,
Joe Clayborough, who was beautiful, played the wife.
Yes.
Wonderful performance.
Good.
Yeah, good. Wonderful performance, and she was so good, and it was just a great experience. And Ryan was great, and it was funny, it was witty, it was, it was, and Augustine Burroughs, who wrote the original book. It was it promised well, and I actually think it's a film that people will discover down the road. I mean, there's a lot of films that I've done which, where I feel at the time audiences weren't quite ready for them, but that. I've always thought that I would, when I go, I've always thought I would have a very good retrospective.
Yes, absolutely.
of hidden treasures that we didn't quite realize. And that's one of them. I feel that about Running with Scissors.
Great. And thank you for elaborating on that. I've heard quite a few stories about Gwyneth Paltrow and also Alec Baldwin. They have been described as rather difficult, actually, to work with. I don't know if that's gossip nonsense.
Well, it's certainly in Gwyneth's case, not at all. I mean, she was not at all difficult. She was absolutely delightful. Okay. So you see, because you find, and Alec the same. I mean, Alec was a producer on the Nuremberg. He was one of the producers of it, and he was playing Robert Jackson. And Robert Jackson was a difficult role because one of the things that happened in that, and I think they had to cut it, which was a great mistake. He was a lawyer, but he was very good, but he was not quite accomplished. And so when he went up against Goering used his whole cross-examination as a he gave Jackson and the American people a history lesson in why National Socialism came about. And it was very clear. It was a very good argument that he had. Unfortunately, we didn't do that in the film. You know, it was tailored and cut. And I think actually Alec probably suffered a bit from that, because it was not as quite as true as it might have been in terms of Jackson's. You know, what happened was that Jackson was this American. He was I can't remember. There was something questionable about his credentials. There was some question about that, and that he came as he was sent on this mission to do these trials, to do the process, but there was something that he hadn't quite done or something. I can't remember what it was, but anyway, what I feel was that that we never quite got to the debate, which was a man saying to an American, "Look, you don't understand what actually happened in our country." And of course, this is also so true of the isolationist aspect of America, is they don't always understand what's going on in Europe, and they have no interest sometimes in the history of European politics, for example. I mean, the struggle between communism and fascism in Germany, they don't get it. They don't understand it. They don't know where it comes from. That was what was interesting about Jackson, is he went into that without the knowledge, so that he wasn't prepped properly, so that actually Goering wiped the floor with him, in reality. Absolutely wiped the floor with him, because he was given a chance to speak, and he gave a lecture. He said, "This is the history." And he went through chapter and verse, historical detail of how, Germany arrived where it arrived. And of course, it was completely dumbfounding to Jackson, because they didn't know. And that's also the differences between two cultures, and that's to do with the isolationist aspect of America. And they don't understand what's going on in the other part of the world. They're very good at sending their soldiers, they're very good at sending their troops, they're very good at being the sort of the world's policeman, but they don't quite understand what they're policing sometimes. And that's what I think was what was interesting in that. So it presented certain difficulties for Alec, though he was fine in the performance, but it was a source of, I think, frustration for him. But he's lovely. He's a wonderful actor, and what has happened to him is just, it's beyond words. It's just, I mean, he's a sweet man. He's a very smart man too. He is. His degree is political science, and I've seen him on. There was a wonderful guy. Again, he's been cancelled tragically, called Charlie Rose, and he used to do these wonderful. I don't know if you ever saw any of his interviews.
I
really
did. Yeah, absolutely.
Very.
I've seen many of his interviews. Yes, absolutely.
A class act, Charlie. Really, I've been interviewed with him, Sander, and he did this one with Alec, which was basically about political science, and it was riveting. And Alec was stunning. Absolutely stunning. And Charlie just elucidated all this amazing stuff for him.
I bet.
So I had a lot of time for Alec, and I think he's a really interesting guy. I mean, Alec's demanding, and quite rightly so, because he's probably smarter than most people,
You also wrote about Steven Seagal in your autobiography, and there have been quite a few stories about Mr. Seagal, and I hope I'm not misquoting, but I think you wrote, "He's just as ludicrous as a person as he is as an actor."
Perhaps I could have elucidated a bit more, but there wasn't, there's so many elements in the book that I talk about, and I just have to touch on them, and not go into them in any depth. But in Stephen's case, Stephen was very generous to me. I have to say that. When I came to live in the LA, and he wanted me in a couple of films, actually. He was a Taekwondo instructor. In fact, my sister went to his class, she told me once. I used to go to his classes somewhere in the valley. And then Mike Ovitz, I think, decided he was going to make him a star. And this this thing they do. They did it with Schwarzenegger. They're doing it with The Rock. They're doing it, and they did it with Steven years ago, where they take someone who's not ostensibly an actor at all, and they make them into this kind of creature, this film creature. And he was a Buddhist, but he was a sort of, I describe him as a Buddhist with an ulcer, because he didn't seem to me to follow any of the Buddhist tenets for relaxation or spiritual presence. And then he was made a Rinpoche, which I thought made kind of nonsense, made the Buddhist faith nonsense. And I just think that he was put in a situation which he wasn't really designed for. He was fine as a Taekwondo instructor. That was okay, and that was subject. And he made mistakes there because he behaved very badly with his master, and there was personal things which all went wrong. But he kind of became a creature, really. And it became a sort of ludicrous thing. He would never do off lines with you. He wouldn't do any of that. That was fine. That didn't bother me, because I just said it would only be a distraction. I just felt that he was full of crap.
I know what you mean. But he did have a kind of a reputation, because I remember director John Flynn, I think it was John Flynn, who complained about Seagal on Out for Justice, I think it was in the early 90s, that he didn't really get along with Steven Seagal, and that Steven showed up late and was a kind of pain in the butt, and so on and so forth and so forth. So that
his discipline was, for someone who has a discipline, he was very undisciplined in his treatment of the work, and he wouldn't do certain things he wouldn't do, and and he did just come across as being quite ludicrous, I just thought, really. But it's also that thing where it's the Hollywood machine that creates these creatures, and then then doesn't take care of them, doesn't actually put them in, give them a sort of a learning curve, because it's all opportunism. The latest thing on the block.
Yeah, the flavor of the month sort of thing.
Latest flavor of the month, and they're so big on that, and it's completely without any sort of without any critical judgment whatsoever, really. Yeah.
You previously mentioned Charlie Rose and that he's been cancelled, and in terms of certain people, I'm not really surprised. Of course, I don't know the whole backstory about Harvey Weinstein and what he did, what he did do, what he didn't do. I shouldn't judge because I don't know the man, but he of course has been cancelled. There's a couple of others, director Brett Ratner. It's just horrible what goes on. If you take a close look at Hollywood and or a close look at any other industry, there is always some controversy.
Well, it's always been present in Hollywood. I mean, it's always been present in Hollywood. The casting couch, all of that whole thing. I've witnessed careers who were cancelled a lot earlier than cancel culture because of certain behavior that they did, particularly in certain casting directors. There was a case of one particular casting director who I knew who had a very, very prestigious position, and he lost it because of certain things that happened, and so it was ever thus, it's not something new. I mean, and some of those producers like Louis B. Mayer and people like that were very, difficult men to work for, So it's been around. As long as Hollywood has been around, it's been around. And it's I'm afraid it's the worst aspect of human nature. And you're not going to cure it overnight.
No, absolutely not. And of course, there are many people with a reputation. I mean, Don Simpson had a bad reputation, and other people. And I also read the biography of Joe Esterhaus, the screenwriter, and many people didn't really come across that well. There's a lot going on behind the scenes, and
so much. I mean, this is the thing, and of course, what we forget about is that they're human beings, And at the moment, the human experiment is a little disappointing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are also so many, or quite a few people who have been described as very nice. Wes Craven, a director whom you've worked with, has been.
Lovely man.
Yeah.
Absolutely delightful man. Really, just the sweetest man. Sweetest man. I mean, there are wonderful people in this profession. You know, I've worked with some really great, amazing characters. You know, really. You know, I mean, it's a great profession in that way. You know, but of course, there's always the bad egg. There's always the
Yeah.
ones who pop up, and then there's the contradiction that goes on with whatever Weinstein's been accused of. But certainly, also, he kind of liberated independent cinema, and you've actually got to, you've got to realize that, as much as, however vile he may appear to some people, he did actually do that. So there's always the yin and the yang of it.
Yeah, the flip side to the coin, so to speak, which
Flip side to the coin. Yeah, exactly.
absolutely.
Exactly.
And, many people produce great results. Many people who have a reputation of being quote unquote difficult. I know people in this industry, people that I've interviewed quite a few times, that said Michael Mann, for instance, was so difficult to please or hard to deal with. And I mean, you've worked with him on Manhunter, one of your first Hollywood movies, a very good movie. And so may I ask you about your interactions with...
Michael was perfectly okay.
Yeah.
He was perfectly fine. But I have heard incidents of Michael and Laterton. I mean, I think on the TV series Luck that him and David Milch did, there was Milch was such a big admirer of Michael's, huge admirer of Michael's. And then when they got to work together, well, only one person can sit on the horse that's leading the charge, and two people can't sit on that horse. It won't work. And of course, there was a clash there. And Milch is a wonderful and very considerate man. And Michael is short in his temper sometimes,
Okay.
but not with me. I mean, you have to seek as you experience, and speak as you experience. And I love working with Michael. I had a great time working with him.
Yeah. I also enjoyed the story about Rob Roy, which you also starred in, directed by Michael Caton Jones. Didn't Michael Caton Jones fire Roger Deakins on that one? I think it's also in your book. Right?
Yes, he did. And he brought in, but actually the DP was German, nice man.
Karl Walter Lindenlaub, that's his name.
Karl Walter Lindenlaub, who I've actually subsequently worked with since. Yeah, he brought Karl in, and it was the first time that Roger had worked in anamorphic, and he hadn't done it before. And Karl was, I don't know, there was all kinds of rumors went around why he was sacked. Apparently, one rumor was that Jessica Lange didn't like her close-ups. That was one thing. I mean, which again is a rumor. I mean, they're all rumors that add to it. But he disappeared, and I just thought, this is one of the great DPs ever.
Yeah.
I mean, the nicest man. I mean, invisible. You never see Roger. He just does his work, and he does it exquisitely, absolutely exquisitely, as the Coen brothers have realized, and they've served him well over the years. And then Caton Jones, he was quite an arrogant person, just came along. I describe him as a bit of an asshole, in my book.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping, but I've got an addendum to the book where I have to say, that person I called an asshole, well, that was 30 years ago. They may not be an asshole any longer.
Yeah.
Or they might still be.
Yeah. I mean, shooting a film is not a picnic. I mean, certain people may come across as very brash and arrogant and cocky, and I mean, there are people in the creative fields who are not people persons.
Everybody has a kind of, story of somebody that they go, oh, well, he was like this. The only director I had any problems with was, and I haven't really had any direct problems with anybody, really. There was a guy called Gary Flader. It was Kiss the Girls, and he directed that. And he was extremely cruel to a person who came on for one day. And the hardest job in film is a one-day player. And there was this very good actress called Rona Mafia who was playing a
Yeah.
forensic expert,
Hmm.
and he was unbelievably rude to her.
Really.
And at one point he said to her, "Oh, you were a lot funnier at the audition." And I went, "Well, it's not a particularly funny part. And what's he talking about?" And I just really didn't like the guy's whole attitude. I just thought, "Well, this is
Okay.
really." And Morgan was the one who kind of finally said, "I think you're going a bit too far with this young woman." You know, I mean, he was very good, Morgan. He came to the fore. But no, he's the only person really. I mean,
Okay.
Doug Liman. I love Doug Liman. He's eccentric as anything, and he's kind of wacky, but I just love him. There's not a director I haven't got on with, really.
Brian, is there anything else you would like to
No, I
add?
think, Michael, we've covered everything, really. I
A
don't think there's
lot.
much more to cover.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've covered a lot.
Brian, I would like to thank you for taking so much time out of your busy
My,
schedule.
my pleasure, Michael. My pleasure.
I really
Absolutely. It's been
appreciate
nice.
that. And I had such a great time talking to you and hope you enjoyed the conversation as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Great.
Very nice.